Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. This is video number 23 and my examination and refutation of the book by Steve Gregg entitled, Why Not Full Preterism? A Partial Preterist Response to a Novel Theological Innovation. Now, I want to call attention to the fact that last week, I shared with you something very, very critical, I think very revealing about Steve Gregg. In 2003, I had a two-day formal debate with Steve. Had a great time, super cordial, a great debate. Anyway, and by the way, that's available from me on my websites. So anyway, during the debate, I cited Acts chapter 24, 13 and following, where Paul said, and this I confess to you, that after the way that they call a sect, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets, there is about to be the resurrection of the dead. I cited that as proof that no matter what we view or how we view eschatology, it has to be viewed as the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, and that includes the resurrection. Well, so I cited Acts chapter 24, 13 to 15. Well, Steve got up and responded that I was misapplying Acts chapter 24, that the passage ought to be read like this. I believe all things that are written in the law and the prophets. And, by the way, I also believe that there will be resurrection of the just and the unjust. In other words, he delineated and drew a sharp contrast between what was in the Old Testament and the doctrine of the resurrection. Now, in his book, as I pointed out last week, he also argued, let me see if I can find that. Here it is. On page 346, he claimed that the church nor the resurrection were foretold in the Old Testament. They were both the mystery of God, unknown anywhere in the Old Testament. So, again, this is somewhat troubling. And look, we're all prone to inconsistency. We're human beings. None of us is perfect, including me, I'll guarantee you. But here's what we have. On page 135 of his book, Steve Gregg says, the Old Testament foretold the resurrection. And on page 126 and 127, he cites Job 19. We'll get to that in a moment. But on page 347, he says, the resurrection was a mystery never foretold in the Old Testament. Now, look, folks, I don't care how you want to slice it. I don't care how much or how you want to dice it. The fact is, no matter how good a person is, no matter how nice they are, and Steve is a genuinely nice guy, it doesn't matter. That's a blatant contradiction. You can't say on the one hand, the Old Testament did not predict the resurrection, as he did in our debate, and as he says on page 347 of his book, or 46, excuse me, and then turn right around and say, well, you know what? Job 19 predicted the resurrection, and Psalm 16 probably predicted the resurrection. Now, as we also need to observe, I cited Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8 as proof that the Old Testament foretold the resurrection. In this book, amazingly, and let me carry that on just a little bit more. I pointed out that Paul, point number one, said his doctrine of the resurrection was from the Old Testament. He cited, Paul did, Isaiah 25 verse 8, Hosea 13 verse 14. I brought both of these passages up in our debate. Steve never responded. But in the book, page 193 and following, Steve says, concerning Isaiah 25 and verse 8. Now remember, Paul quotes verbatim from Isaiah 25:8 in 1 Corinthians 15:55 and 56, and says those verses, Isaiah 25, Hosea 13, and by the way, he also echoes Daniel chapter 12 and Ezekiel 37, and I just have to make this observation. Steve Gregg believes that Daniel chapter 12 was a prediction of the spiritual resurrection of Israel in AD 70. He says that Ezekiel 37 was likewise. Well, it was one of two things. The restoration of Judah and Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity, or it was fulfilled in Christ in the first century. So here we have Paul echoing Ezekiel 37, echoing Daniel chapter 12, both of which Steve Gregg says, particularly Daniel 12, applied to AD 70. But then listen to what he has to say about Isaiah 25. Now, mind you, in our debate in Denver in 2013, he didn't say a word about Hosea. In the book, if he mentions Hosea, I haven't found it. And I've gone through a lot of the territory. So here's what he says about Isaiah 25 and verse 8. Quote, "It can be persuasively argued that the earlier verses in Isaiah 25 describe the end of the old covenant with the coming of the new order of Messiah. Verse 2 mentions the destruction of the city, that is most likely Jerusalem, followed by a number of images suggesting the messianic, that is the present age. There are repeated references to things that will take place, quote, in that day, unquote, chapter 24:21, 25:9, 27:1, and in or on this mountain. The passage appears best to be understood as a description of the establishment of the kingdom on the spiritual Mount Zion after the destruction of the old temple and city. In the midst of the prophecy, we find the prediction alluded to by Paul. So, Isaiah 25, 1-7, AD 70, or at least in currently fulfilled. Isaiah 25, 9 and following, fulfilled in Christ and the church now in the new covenant order. But he continues. Preston points out that the context of this verse, verse 8, which Paul quotes as something to be fulfilled in the resurrection, is the passing of the old covenant order in AD 70, to which I would answer, so it is. However, now look folks, you got to catch the power of this. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 quotes verbatim from Isaiah 25:8. The context of Isaiah 25 is the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the Old Covenant age, which occurred in AD 70. Steve Gregg says, yes, that is the context of verse 8. But what does he do with verse 8, therefore? I mean, after all, if the context of verse 8, if all of the surrounding verses refer to AD 70, then why doesn't verse 8 refer to AD 70? Well, here's what he says. He then claims that the tenets of the passage point to the time before the end. Well, I'm commenting here. And then he says, this, verse 8, corresponds to the resurrection that Paul and Christ predicted will occur at the last day. Isaiah 25:8 predicts this, but does not indicate when God will do this. Now listen carefully. Catch the power of what Steve Gregg is claiming. The statement can easily be seen as a standalone prediction and taken as a parenthetical telling what God will someday do without mentioning at what point during that age he will do it. What Paul tells us, and Isaiah does not, is when that statement will be fulfilled. Wait a minute. You know, folks, I'm telling you, this is more than serious. And this is very, very poor. This is not exegesis. This is eisegesis in the extreme. Now notice, verses 1 through 7, per Steve Gregg, applied to AD 70, the end of the Old Covenant order. Well, notice this. Verse 6, in that day, the Lord shall make on this mountain. What is that mountain? It's spiritual Zion, says Steve Gregg. So at the time of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, at the time of the end of the Old Covenant age, Steve Gregg says the Messianic banquet would be prepared. Okay, that's verses 1 to 7. Well, let's skip down to verse 9. In that day. Well, what's the antecedent to in that day? Oh, it's verse 8. The time of the resurrection. But Steve Gregg admits that verses 9 and following refer to AD 70. But now Steve wants to divorce, 100% completely, totally divorce verse 8 from the preceding discussion and divorce it from the following discussion, even though verse 6 is in that day and verse 9 is in that day. Ladies and gentlemen, where's the exegetical, where's the contextual support from saying, you know what, verse 8 is a standalone, independent, parenthetical insertion into the text that has nothing whatsoever to do with the context. It is sandwiched between in that day, verse 9, and in that day, verse 7. And even though Steve admits that verse 6 and 7, he admits that verse 9 refers to AD 70 in the first century. Once again, he rips verse 8 completely out of that context and says, no, it's a standalone, independent, parenthetical statement. And by the way, he claims the same thing. He says this kind of prophecy is found a lot of times in the Old Testament. No, it doesn't. But let me reiterate, folks, the key factor here is that Steve admits what the context is about. The end of the Old Covenant system in AD 70. Verses 1 to 7, verse 9 and following. That's the context for verse 8. But yet verse 8 is supposedly totally independent, totally unrelated, parenthetical prophecy. And yet in one sense, that doesn't help Steve at all. You know why? Well, because he's already told us the Old Testament didn't predict the resurrection. But right here in Isaiah 25, verse 8, which is an Old Testament prophecy, we find the prediction of the resurrection. Would Steve argue? Well, even though it's found in the Old Testament, it's not really an Old Testament prophecy. Well, how would you go about proving that? Exactly and precisely, how would you go about proving that a prophecy that is found in an Old Testament book is not an Old Testament prophecy? You see, the resurrection of verse 8 is described in verse 9 as in that day is the day of Israel's salvation. Folks, you cannot divorce the day of Israel's salvation from the day of resurrection. That's all there is to it. That's why that term, in that day, is so critical. In that day, we will say, this is our God. We have waited for him. This is our God. He will save us. And in that day, we will rejoice. In what day? The day of resurrection, the day of salvation. The day of salvation is the day of Christ's coming. Hebrews 9:28. But the day of Christ's coming is the day of the resurrection. This is unavoidable. This is absolutely undeniable. It is, to use the old term, unget-overable. Well, with all of that in front of us, let's take a quick look at Job chapter 19. As I promised you last week, there are several things that I want to get to about Job chapter 19 to demonstrate the fallacy of appealing to this passage as a prophecy of an end-time resurrection. Now, Job, in the midst of all of his trouble, in the midst of all of his trouble, said, I know that my Redeemer lives. And in the latter time, he will stand upon the earth, and my eyes shall see him. And here's where the rub begins. Does Job say, as the translation that Steve offers us on page 127, here's the translation that Steve offers us. I know that my Redeemer lives, he shall stand at last on the earth. And that term at last is unfortunately in some translations rendered as in the last day, but it's at the last. Doesn't tell us at the last of what. Nonetheless, he shall stand at last on the earth, and after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, my eyes shall behold, and not another. So Steve sets this forth, and here's what's troublesome. Every single commentary that I have in my library, and that includes my Logos Bible study program, calls attention to the fact of the incredibly difficult, incredibly troubled, if I may use that term, translational issues that are associated with Job chapter 19 and verse 25. In the McClintock and Strong Biblical Encyclopedia, Dictionary and Encyclopedia of Biblical Literature, which is still to this day considered one of the most reliable and, quote, conservative, unquote, not radically conservative, but nonetheless very conservative overall. It has an extended discussion on Job chapter 19. This is volume 8, page 1053 and following. Now, here is what this encyclopedia of biblical, theological, and ecclesiastical literature has to say on point number 6. The language, when exactly rendered, contains no warrant for such an interpretation, i.e., physical resurrection. Especially the phrase, yet in my flesh shall I see God, which should rather be rendered out of my flesh. And listen, folks, all you have to do is go to BibleGateway.com and just look up Job 19, verse 25, 26, and look it up in all of the English translations, and you will see for yourself how commonly the translations render it just as McClintock and Strong suggest. Out of my flesh, or not in my flesh, shall I see God. Now, here's what's amazing to this. In some of the apocryphal books, the book of Enoch, I believe it's the Apocalypse of Abraham, or the work on Abraham. There's some others. And Margaret Barker, by the way, in her book, Gateway to Heaven, calls attention to this. But in the book of Enoch and in the book of Abraham, has Enoch speaking and saying he saw all of the worthy faithful of the past, and they stood before God, and in full agreement with Job's rendering of out of my flesh, they say, these apocryphal books say, they have Enoch saying, I saw there the faithful worthies of all of the ages stand before God in their glorified bodies, having put off their body of flesh. You see, they agreed with the rendering of Job 19 suggested by McClintock and Strong and by a great number of biblical translations. And I should point out this passage, or this particular fact as well. N.T. Wright points out that in the world of scholarship today, there are few, if any, and now he says this in his massive tome on the resurrection of the Son of God. And he says there are few, if any, biblical scholars today that would appeal to Job chapter 19, 25, and 26 as a prediction of the resurrection. Why? Because of the translational issues that are involved in the text. Now, there's an interesting fact about the book of Job that is seldom, if ever, noted. And I want to call your attention to this. And this is challenging, folks. What I'm about to share with you is challenging because we have passages like Daniel chapter 12, which predicted the resurrection. But the question is, and that Steve Gregg admits and recognizes as a serious question, what kind of resurrection? Biological, physical? Steve Gregg says, oh, no. It's not what Daniel predicted. Ezekiel 37, the coming out of the graves. Is that literal or physical? And physical, or is it metaphoric and spiritual? Well, Steve Gregg says, no, it's metaphoric and spiritual. Why do I say all that? Well, because there are 4, perhaps 5, passages in the book of Job which emphatically denies physical resurrection out of physical graves. You catch the power of that? There are at least 4, perhaps 5, prophecies or statements, I should say, in the book of Job, in which Job, not any of his friends. By the way, don't you think if there was to be a physical resurrection, that one of Job's 4, quote, friends, unquote, might have brought it up and to say, you know, Job, it would be better for you to die so that you would arise from the grave in the future, vindicated and glorified by the Lord in a new body, without all of your boils. They don't ever do that. What did Job himself have to say about dying physically and the grave? In other words, we don't have any room or latitude to say that Job is talking about whether or not he's talking about physical death and physical graves. That's the subject. And here's what he says. In Job chapter 7, verse 7 and then 8 to 10, he says, my days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and they are spent without hope. Remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. The eye of him who sees me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall no longer be. As the cloud disappears and vanishes away, so so the one who goes down to the grave does not come up. He shall never return to his house, nor shall his place know him anymore. Job is talking about physical death, physical grave, going into the grave and never coming out. Now, one might argue, well, that's as far as Job knew. And it's to be granted that Job did not know the full story, as we shall see. In Job 10, 20 and 22, are not my days few? Cease. Speaking to his friends, boy, Job, you must be a real rascal. You must be a sinner above all sinners. And he goes, would you guys just leave me alone? That I may take a little comfort before I go to the place from which I shall not return. Now we'll come back to Job 14 in a moment. Job 17, 13 to 16. If I wait for the grave as my house, if I make my bed in the darkness, if I say to corruption, you are my father, and to the worm, you are my mother and my sister. That's pretty obvious physical decay. Where then is my hope? As for my hope, who can see it? Will they go down to the gates of Sheol? Shall we have rest together in the dust? Now, Job 14. Job 14 says, as for man who dies and goes to the grave, there is no hope. Now, if you cut a stump down, cut a tree down, and there's a stump, and if you water it, there is hope that it will bloom again, but not so with man. But then he poses a question. Now, I want you to consider this question in light of his earlier affirmations of no coming out of the grave. Job poses the famous, historically verified, historically perplexing question. If a man dies, will he live again? He didn't ask, will a man come out of the grave? He says, will a man live again? You want the answer to that question? John 11, 25 and following. If a man dies, those who believe in me, even though he dies, yet shall he live. I am the resurrection. If a man dies, he will live. See, Jesus is answering Job's question. But it wasn't a question, if a man dies and goes into the grave, will he come out? It is a question, if a man dies, will he live? There's an alternate explanation to the concept of resurrection here in Job that fits perfectly with the actual context of the book. Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I will see him with my own eyes. And by the way, McClintock and Strong, a host of commentators say what Job is actually waiting for, and this fits perfectly the Hebraic concept of resurrection. When a man was oppressed, when he had fatal diseases, when he had lost everything, he was considered dead. But to be restored from that condition was considered resurrection. All you have to do is read John Levinson's book on resurrection. But here is Job saying, I know that my Redeemer lives. I know he will stand upon the earth, and I will see him with my eyes. So the commentators, many, many, many of them, say what Job is asking for, what Job is praying for, what Job is confident about is to be vindicated, to be restored to his former position and prominence and wealth. Well, guess what? In Job 42 and verse 5, Job says, my eyes have seen the Lord. And the very next two verses tell us that the Lord restored him to even more than he had before. So here we have, in Job 19, Job's affirmation, confidence that Yahweh would look upon him in favor. And he said, I know, I will look upon the Lord. He will see me, I will see him. And in chapter 42, he says, I have seen the Lord. And Job is restored. Seems to me that's by far the better explanation. So we have the translational issues of Job that Steve never even mentions in his book. We have the statements in the book of Job, at least 4 of them, in which Job says, I'm going to the grave and never coming out. But posing the question, okay, those who die, will they live? And we have Jesus answering it. He is the resurrection. Those who believe in him never die. Those who believe in him, although they die, they will live. There's Job's answer. And then we have Job saying, I know that I will see the Lord. My eyes will look upon him. And in chapter 42, he says, my eyes have seen the Lord. And he was restored. As a closing thought, let me point out, not one of the early patristic writers, not one of the early church writers, and I love this because people all the time appeal to the patristic writers. Oh, Preston, you don't ever agree with the patristic writers. Well, I sometimes do when they agree with the Bible, but here's the point. Very quickly, got to close. Not one patristic writer that I'm aware of, and according to many, many sources, according to McClinic and Strong, not one. Jesus didn't appeal to Job 19. None of the apostles appealed to Job 19. Not one of the early writers. None of the apostolic writers, none of the patristic writers ever appealed to Job 19 as a prophecy of the resurrection of biologically dead human beings. Not one of them. To me, that's pretty powerful. So the final analysis is, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that my friend Steve Gregg is entirely wrong, entirely misguided, and certainly self-contradictory in his position on the Old Testament and resurrection. I believe it's completely wrong to appeal to Job chapter 19. And I'm totally out of time, but let me remind you in closing of my fantastic 2-book special for the month of May 2023, U.S. orders only, total delivered price $39.95. That will save you $17. Go to my website, DontePreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, click the banner at the top, order the books. In the meantime, you have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you on Monday.